Hola, Commander players. Today, it's time that we look to the skies for Derevi Bird Flu Tribal.
First, let's meet the commander. This is Derevi, Imperial Tactician, green, white, blue, 2/3 flyer that came out of the second commander set, I believe, way back in the day. I'm very old. Anyways, this card did see some CEDH play. It is fairly powerful. If you read the text box, whenever it enters the battlefield or a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may tap or untap target permanent. And that means you can untap mana rocks. You can untap lands such as Gaia's Cradle. I don't have one in here, but you could. The other second benefit to Derevi, which is pretty amazing, is that for just a colorless green, white, blue, you can put Derevi onto the battlefield from the command zone. What this means is he completely evades the commander tax. Derevi will never have to cost more than 4 mana for the entirety of the game, so you always have access to it, which is pretty stellar because the deck does kind of revolve around accruing incremental power and advantage through Derevi's ability, since birds are a fairly underpowered tribe when you compare them with such a thing as vampires. Now let's meet some of the birds you'll be playing in Derevi. Classic birds like Birds of Paradise, great, ramps you. Artificer's Assistant, a 1/1 that flies. I do like some low-powered birds in here because honestly, the birds will get bigger, and we'll show you why that is later. So it's okay to have some 1/1 flyers in here. It may seem dinky, but incremental effects like the one Artificer's Assistant have are important. So I do have some legendary birds in here. I have artifacts. So if I cast one of those spells, I could describe one, and over time, that can get you a little bit of an advantage. And that's what this deck is all about, just tiny little advantages, trying to play as cleanly as you can. Next over, we have Flying First Strike Bird, just a random raptor with a giant explosion. Behind it, sure, very epic. Judge's Familiar, standard all-star, can occasionally maybe catch somebody off guard and counter an instant or sorcery spell unless they pay 1 mana. Skycat Sovereign makes the most amazing tokens ever. In fact, I think I have some. Let's see. Yes, cat birds. Amazing. I love cats and birds, and I have both decks. But Skycat can get pretty large, and you will make quite a bit of mana in this deck, as you'll see soon. So having mana dumps like this, or next to it, River Hoopoe, which is a hilarious bird, to draw cards, get incremental advantage is super important. Watcher of the Spheres, not too bad. Just decreases the cost of your birds as a random flying 2/2, and whenever another creature with flying enters the battlefield under your control, Watcher of the Spheres gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Occasionally you can dump some tokens, as you'll see right below. These are sort of my lower cost birds. We'll show the higher ones later, but we've got something like Flurry of Wings. Put X 1/1 white bird soldier creature tokens into flying into play at instant speed, where X is the number of attacking creatures. So if you were attacking with 6 birds, including, say, Watcher of the Spheres, and you were just like, hold up before damage, I'm going to go ahead and drop Flurry of Wings, I'm going to make 6 new birds, all of a sudden he becomes an 8/8, and that's a lot more devastating. Aven Mind Sensor is a great but mean sort of trick that occasionally you can catch someone off guard who's trying to search their library for maybe a game-ending spell. Nimble Obstructionist, similarly, if you cycle it, you can counter a target activated or triggered ability, or you can cast it with Flash if you're just trying to end the game through attacking. Soaring Show Off can gain some political advantage. Enters the battlefield, each player draws a card. You're not too worried about other people drawing cards, especially early on. I just like it. It's kind of fun to give people cards, especially if there's one really difficult player at the table and you need everybody to try and filter through their decks. Kanji's Lieutenant, the Encore ability is pretty cool. It lets you get some graveyard recursion. Ledger Shredder, we know all about it if you're paying attention to Standard. Those counters, with the connive counters, can get out of hand. And Cartographer's Hawk, not bad if you're just a little bit behind on mana and you're trying to ramp up and keep up in the game. Okay, so here's some of the more powerful birds. Curiosity Crafter, fairly expensive for a bird. I think it's like $7 or something. But you have no maximum hand size, and whenever a creature token you control deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. Well, as you saw with Flurry of Wings in the last little part of the video, and also with the card right next to it, Battle Screech, and maybe some other cards here in the very near future, you do make quite a few bird tokens. So being able to draw cards every time they deal combat damage is pretty amazing. Battle Screech is pretty awesome. If you have Derevi out, you cast this the turn right after you put Derevi out, say, turn 4, and you get 2 birds, but then you immediately tap Derevi, tap the 2 birds you just put out, and you can flash this back for free to make 2 more birds. So it's a quick, early way to gain some extra bird tokens. Next we have Falco Spara. I talked about this bird earlier. Bird Demon, pretty cool. I even got the cool art for it, or at least what I think is the cool art. And occasionally you do put counters on creatures, which you'll see in this deck. So this card can give you advantage. It's not a bad card by any means in this deck. It just, Derevi is far more powerful for what we're trying to do. I would have to change up a lot of the birds to try and take more advantage of Falco Spara if that was the commander. Next we have Skyway Robber, one of the new birds. Like I said, there's been a lot of new birds in the past 5 years that have helped put birds sort of not over the top, but at least in contention. Flying, you can escape it from the graveyard, another great way to just keep recurring things if people board wipe you. It escapes with, whenever Skyway Robber deals combat damage to a player, you may cast an artifact, instant, or sorcery spell from among cards exiled with Skyway Robber without paying its mana cost. So not only does it recur itself, but it recurs the things that it escaped with. So pretty flavorful card overall. Kanji Sky Warden, whenever it attacks, attacking creatures with flying get +2/+0, and whenever it blocks, they get +0/+2. This is sort of a mini anthem for your little bird tokens that makes them a little bit more deadly. Next, we have the original Kanji, Airy Keeper. Has the craziest looking face or mask or whatever that is, but this is sort of a win condition on its own. As you'll see, you will be able to make quite a bit of mana in this deck, so kicking this multiple times to put feather counters on Kanji and then thus make all birds bigger is definitely a viable way to win the game. Aerial Extortionist, pretty underrated card for Commander, I think, right now. 4/3 flyer, already pretty great. Whenever it enters the battlefield or deals combat damage to a player, exile up to 1 target non-land permanent. For as long as that card remains exiled, its owner may cast it. So it's not too feel bad. You're not permanently getting rid of something, you're just kind of slowing them down. Whenever another player casts a spell from anywhere other than their hand, then you get to draw a card. So not only do you slow them down, but you also get to draw some extra advantage as they're trying to catch back up. Migratory Route, great for early if you're missing out on some particular lands and you do need to hit your forest, which we'll talk about later. But also you can just make 4 1/1 bird tokens. Nothing wrong with that. Crookclaw Elder, oldie but goodie. Love this bird. You tap 2 untapped birds you control and you draw a card. You can do that as many times as you want. And you notice with this commander, you could say attack with a bunch of birds and then untap more birds and then do it all over. So you can get into some shenanigans with this. There are no infinite loops that I know of in here, but I'm sure you could find that in other decks. And then finally, Beck and Call. Again, make more bird tokens, or whenever a creature enters the battlefield this turn, you may draw a card. So if you fuse these together, like you can make quite a bit of mana in this deck. 8 is not a problem. Yeah, just a lot of card draw and birds. What more do you want? The ramp package. Let's start getting into sort of the bones of the deck now that we've talked about most of the birds, not all. I'm keeping some secret for a little special section at the end. Why this deck may be called Bird Flu and not just a bird tribal deck. But anyways, we have some pretty low mana ramp. We have green, we might as well use some of the best. And with Derevi's ability of being able to untap lands, I really like the idea of putting things like Wild Growth and Utopia Sprawl on a land to make them produce more than they already would. It's a pretty neat effect to have access to. So also, similarly, we're going to use Soul Ring, but also Mana Vault. Mana Vault can be a pain to pay for during your upkeep to untap it, or else it does damage to you. It can be a good early ramp, but then it might bite you in the butt later. But in this deck, you have no worries about untapping Mana Vault. You may take a damage here or there, but that's about it. There's no need to pay the mana into it to untap it. Similarly, we have a lot of 2-mana ramp. All your basic green 2-mana ramps that I can think of. Ramp of Growth, 3 Visits, Nature's Lore. Into the North, I am running Snow Lands in here, and the Snow Duels, which are pretty sweet budget options, and also Farseek. So I do run plenty of duels in here, and you will see some proxies. I do have some proxies of, your super OP duels. It's mostly just to make the deck function just a little bit better. They are not vital though. If you don't want to run that kind of thing, or you can't run that kind of thing, feel free, change them out for whatever. I'll show you some really great budget options that are way better in this deck than the duels, to be honest. Going with the theme of the last section, we want to talk about some of the value you can get from Derevi being able to untap lands. So we're only running 35 lands, but we do have a good bit of ramp, a lot of card draw, and so I'm not really too worried about hitting the lands. So we can run things like Temple of the False God pretty effectively without any fear. And it taps for 2. So with Derevi, it taps for 4 effectively. Ancient Tomb, same way, taps for 4. Gavany Township doesn't tap for extra mana, but it can put extra counters on all of your creatures, which is pretty powerful. Similarly, we have Simic Growth Chamber, Selesnya Sanctuary, and Azorius Chancery. All tap for 2 mana. All will allow you to bring a land back to your hand. So if, for instance, you're lucky enough to have pulled something like a Boseiju or something out, and you want to play it as land early, but you want to return it to your hand later, this is a great way to pull those lands that double as spell effects back to your hand when you really need them. And also, they tap for 4 colored mana, which is awesome. And here is sort of a overview of the rest of the lands in the deck. I'm running Snowland so that I can use Into the North. Windbrisk Heights is pretty cool. So Windbrisk Heights says that it has hideaways for 4. Okay, so you look at the top cards, you put one of them face down, you put the rest on the bottom of your library. And for 1 mana and tapping Windbrisk Heights, you can play the card you put face down without paying its mana cost if you attack with 3 or more creatures. Well, you're playing a bird swarm kind of bird tribal deck. It's not a problem to attack with 3 creatures. So you can get pretty good value off of that sometimes. The other all-star that I really want to mention, one thing that, for years and years I've been kind of fooling around with birds just because I thought it was a really funny tribal thing that they tried to get away with in like Mercadian Masks and stuff. And one of the cards that they used was pretty sweet now that we have a lot more cool birds, and that is none other than Seaside Haven. I even got a sweet foily version of it. You pay a white and a blue, tap it, sacrifice a bird, and draw a card. Otherwise, it just comes in on tap, makes a colorless mana. Not too shabby. Not too shabby at all. Lastly, rounding out the ramp package is a card that I think is great in any colors that can run it, Mirari's Wake. Creatures you control get a bonus, and whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana of any type that land produced. So even your 2 mana lands, which used to make 4 with Derevi, now they make 6. So it gets out of hand pretty quickly. I will Enlighten Tutor or Wargate for this fairly often. I like having more mana rather than less, and the more I have, the better I feel, because as you'll see, with a lot of our extra cards, we like to have mana left untapped. We like to have some instant speed effects to protect ourselves, and it just makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside. Yes, let's talk about some of that card draw. I mean, we saw some incremental card draw on the birds themselves earlier with things like River Hoopoe, but here's some interesting and flavorful ones. Distant Melody, choose a creature type, draw a card for each permanent you control that type. It's always going to be birds. Similarly, Airborne Aid, draw a card for each bird in play. Vanquisher's Banner pumps your birds up and also draws you extra cards. Sphinx's Revelation, this is where the form starts to take a little bit of a backseat to the function. It does have wings. I mean, it's a giant bird, kind of. Gain X life and draw X cards at instant speed. Pretty awesome. Then we have things like Reconnaissance Mission and Biden of Thassa, which allow you to draw cards every time one of your birds deals combat damage to a player, which is pretty amazing. And Dig Through Time, I don't have Treasure Cruise. I didn't have room. I wanted to include things like Airborne Aid. And this is instant speed, and I like it quite a bit better. Here's a little special spotlight also on some mana production that at first isn't mana production. Growing Rites of Itlimoc and Dowsing Dagger, both 2 flip cards from Ixalan block that are pretty stellar in this deck. The Growing Rights of Itlamok. Sorry for the shaky cam, I'm holding it. You can flip it once you have 4 more creatures on the battlefield at end of turn, and then you get Itlamok Cradle of the Sun, which is in effect a Guy's Cradle. Add 1 green mana for each creature you control. Similarly, Dowsing Dagger also pumps up to be an awesome land. When it comes into play, you give somebody some plant tokens, which birds do not care about, it turns out. And then you equip this, say on your Derevi, attack, and as soon as you deal combat damage to a player, which is pretty easy with a bunch of flyers, you get to flip Dowsing Dagger. And Dowsing Dagger then becomes Lost Veil. Just taps for 3 mana of any one color. And you can do that lots of times, so it either taps for 6 or 8 with Derevi out, and Mirari's Wait. So, only 2 sections left in the deck tech, where we're going to talk about sort of protection, which is right now, and then we're going to talk about win conditions and that extra special set of birds that I mentioned earlier. So, I like Dusk Dawn in this deck. There's about 8 or 9 birds off the top of my head that have power 2 or less, so you can get back something from the graveyard after you have to board wipe. Doomscar is in here solely because it has a bird in foil on the card itself. So I'm down with that. Cyclonic Rift, great card. Not the friendliest card, but hopefully you've amassed enough birds to make the game in fairly quickly, or you are just so desperate that you need to wipe the board clean. Swords to Plowshare. This is the art that has a bird on it, so it's in my deck. Raven Form. Similarly, pretty cool card. Has a bird in the art, has a bird in the text box, makes a bird, and foretells. Cynic Charm can protect all your lovely birds by giving them hexproof. Swan Song, Fierce Guardianship. Of course, you gotta have a Swan Song. You're gonna give other people birds. Fierce Guardianship, great to remove a board wipe from the play or whatever you need to do with it. Teferi's Protection, of course, unspoken rule has to go in a commander deck. This is a proxy. I do own one, but you got to put them in all the commander decks, so one is not enough. Heroic Intervention, another great card. Give your creatures indestructible and hexproof. Pretty awesome in case anybody does like Blasphemous Act or something. Okay, here are some basic win conditions. Broker's Ascendancy can get out of hand. I'm testing it out right now. I'm not for sure if it's the best. We'll see. But if it stays out for a couple turns, then your birds will be pretty dang large. Similarly, here's an oldie but goodie. I love this one. Soul Catcher's Airy. 2 mana enchantment. Whenever a bird is put into your graveyard from play, put a feather counter on Soul Catcher's Airy. All birds get +1/+1 for each feather counter on Soul Catcher's Airy. Pretty amazing. So you want to board wipe me? Great. As soon as I get some more birds out, they're all going to be like 8/8s. And finally, All Runs Epiphany. I know it wasn't beloved in Standard, but in this deck it has a bird and it makes birds, and it helps you take an extra turn to try and finish off a particularly tough opponent with just a whole swarm of them. Now next up, we're going to talk about my favorite part, which is why the deck has the bird flu name. Finally, this section of the deck tech is brought to you by my friend Carl. Carl has a deck that gains a bajillion life and has a bunch of sort of pillow fort effects, and the birds just couldn't do the job last time. So I've added this, and I really quite like it. For one, you do want to finish the game, and with a bunch of birds, you can always depend on Triumph of the Hordes to make a bunch of small tokens into something far deadlier. Grafted Exoskeleton, like I said, with things like Soul Catcher's Airy, Broker's Ascendancy, certain birds, like Watcher of the Skies, I believe was one that got bigger for every other flyer. Grafted Exoskeleton can present a lethal infect threat. And then we had some other birds that nobody really plays in infect decks, because white infect is not really a thing, so maybe people don't remember, but in New Phyrexia, birds were all messed up. And so I've got 2 of the flyer birds, of course they're flyers, but from New Phyrexia, which I think is really funny addition to a bird flu or a bird tribal deck, period. And then also Thrumming Bird, Phyrexian Bird Horror. Can you get better than that? I don't know if you can. It proliferates things. It'll proliferate feather counters, which we saw were pretty powerful. It'll proliferate shield counters, all sorts of things. whatever you want it to. Pretty great bird. Ugly looking, but great. Well, anyways, thank you all for watching my deck tech on bird flu tribal, and I hope you have a great one.